Your vote is worth exactly $568.07. So in my last video, I claimed that your vote was worth about $1,000, and I had an interesting response to that video. A few of the comments were kind of annoying, but for the most part, actually, they were really perceptive, hinting at some interesting economic principles and paradoxes. So I thought I'd make a more informal follow-up video considering a few of these topics. To start with, I got a number of comments like this that wondered why I didn't just look at per-person campaign spending to measure the value of a vote. Well, let's take a quick shot at that. OpenSecrets.org estimates that there's going to be about $16 billion worth of campaign spending this election. That's more than ever, although adjusted for inflation, 2020 looks to have been more expensive. But let's take this number and divide it by the total number of votes in the 2020 election. Of course, I know these are different years, but it's an estimate. So plugging that into Wolfram, we get a value of $102.25. So that looks like a factor of 10 less than the $1,000 I claimed in the previous video. But as Quinine379 points out, really that money is directed at undecided voters. With how polarized our politics has become, most people's votes are off the market at this point. I know mine is. According to the Pew Research Center, about 18% of voters are undecided. So that means that we can take this denominator and multiply it by 0.18. And if we do that, we get a value of $568 per vote, which is a lot closer to the 1,000 I mentioned in my video. And again, this is a national average, so if you're in a swing state, the value is probably quite a bit higher, since campaign spending is considerably higher per capita. So it looks like no matter how you slice it, your vote is pretty valuable. But still, these numbers are a little bit different, and it's interesting to think about why that might be. Well, as commenter Mitch Burns points out, these two methods of calculation are measuring different things. One is trying to understand how much your vote should be worth to you. I mean, the altruism discount factor alone makes it a very personal number. On the other hand, the campaign spending approach is trying to figure out how much your vote is worth to all the donors and special interests funding campaigns. And in a way, it makes sense that the number should be lower for special interests, since I suspect that at least some of those donors don't have altruistic motives. And look, I'm not an economist, I just come from a family of them, but let's think back to our basic supply and demand graph. See, the point of this graph is to show the equilibrium price. But there's a difference between the equilibrium price and the value for different people involved in the market. This whole part of the demand curve up here is people who would pay more than the equilibrium price for the good. And this whole part of the supply curve is people who would sell you the good for less than the market price. Economists call this area right here the consumer surplus, and this area right here the producer surplus. And things like price discrimination are all about producers trying to capture some of the consumer surplus. So TLDR, market price does not equal value. Your vote may be worth a lot more to you than to someone trying to influence it. Okay, now moving on to paradoxes, this person points out that expected value doesn't really make sense when you're talking about huge amounts of money and tiny probabilities. And to this I say, yeah, expected value has some serious issues. One of my favorite examples of this is the St. Petersburg paradox, which imagines a game in which we flip a coin repeatedly until we come up with heads. If heads appears on the first toss, the payout is $2. The second toss, it's $4, then $8, then $16, then $32, and so on. Every time you get a tails, the payout doubles. So how much would you pay to play this game? Well, according to expected value, you should do whatever it takes to play this game, because the expected value of playing the game is infinite. There's a 1 in 2 chance you'll get $2, a 1 in 4 chance you'll get $4, a 1 in 8 chance you'll get $8, a 1 in 16 chance you'll get $16, and so on. And because of the clever setup, the value of each one of these terms is $1. And since there are an infinite number of terms, the expected value is infinite. But like, how much would you pay to play this game? I think for me it would be about $10. And if you're curious about why, like exactly where does this break down, I really recommend the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman, who along with Amos Tversky launched the whole field of behavioral economics. It's an amazing, amazing book. So yeah, I hope it's clear at this point that despite the title, the point of my whole vote value calculation was not that you should take it as some sort of definitive answer. To me, the whole reason for the exercise was to show you how much money is at stake in these elections, as compared with the comparatively decent odds of your vote being decisive. Okay, here's another criticism. How can we possibly say that flipping the election is worth $100 billion to you personally, when if you offer people a choice between $100 billion and them getting to personally decide the election, I think most of us would pick the $100 billion. So I think this comment is actually really interesting because it gets at the non-linearity of the value or utility of money. See, if you're broke and have a family to feed, $100 could mean the world to you. But if you're a billionaire, an extra $1 million pretty much makes no difference in your life whatsoever. So let's alter the premise a little bit. First, I'm going to give you $1 billion, no strings attached. Then I'm going to ask you if you'd like another $100 billion or to personally decide the outcome of the election. For me personally, at this point, with $1 billion already in my bank account, I'd choose to decide the outcome of the election. But what would you do? Anyway, I think it's really interesting how our brains process really large numbers and really tiny probabilities. And again, the point of my last video is to help you wrap your head around the relative size of government spending versus the improbability of you literally deciding the election. Okay, this next comment makes a really important point, because it's not just the money that the government spends. As such an enormous player in our economy, the government has the ability to create and destroy whole industries. Economist Mariana Mazzucato talks about this in The Entrepreneurial State. She talks about how something like the iPhone, which depending on your perspective you might consider to be a triumph of private enterprise and innovation, was only possible because of enormous government investment in things like GPS, touchscreens, and the internet. So which party do you want controlling this enormous investment in infrastructure, literally shaping the nature of our economy for the coming generations? Personally, I want it to be a party that, however flawed, believes in climate change. One other point that was made in some of the comments is that my calculation presupposes that you have some preference for one party over the other. And in fact, maybe it's presupposing a fairly strong preference since it's using the full range of variability in spending. So it might be reasonable to scale your personal number by how strongly you feel about one party versus the other party and how they're going to spend the money. But that said, as I mentioned in the previous video, my calculation also underestimated in some ways too, since it only looked at the variability in total spending. If one party is going to spend an extra $20 billion on law enforcement and $20 billion less on social programs, that's actually going to get ignored by my calculation because the total spending isn't going to change. But you might actually care about both the $20 billion more and the $20 billion less. And so maybe I overestimated the strength of your preferences. But I think I also undercounted in other ways too. And to me, they sort of seem like they might balance out. Oh, hey, and one last thing. As many commenters pointed out, even if your state is a foregone conclusion as far as the Electoral College is concerned, don't sleep on the House, the Senate, and of course local and regional elections. The stakes may be lower in dollar terms, but the probability that your vote is decisive counterbalances that. And if anything, they're more important because the results hit closer to home. So if I haven't made this clear already, I really hope you go vote. To that end, a really good resource is vote.org, which is a kind of one-stop shop for all of your voting-related questions. Okay, enough politics. I'm genuinely over this election and ready to go back to nerdy music shit. Hey, Mark with a different shirt here just to give you a little bonus material. See, when I was researching the original video, I noticed this net interest part of the budget, this big chunk of the federal budget that just goes to paying interest on the national debt. And I saw this CNN article about how that's just going to get even worse because interest rates are going up. And there's this interesting quote in the article about how for a long time when interest rates were practically at zero, it was almost free money. Because interest rates were so low, almost no matter how big the debt got, this chunk of the federal budget was really pretty small. But now that interest rates are going up, it gets more and more significant. And of course, that brought to mind this whole fight about raising the debt limit. But here's the thing. Even though you may look at this part of the budget and think, man, we'd better not get into any more debt, choosing to default on the debt that we have to not pay the interest on the current debt is the most flipping bonkers thing that you can do. Because if the US defaults on its debt, that debt becomes a much riskier asset, and risky assets have higher interest rates. So if you want to do the absolute worst possible thing you can do when it comes to controlling this part of the federal budget, default on the debt that we currently have. So yeah, obviously it's an important conversation, like how much debt should we take on as a nation? What's the optimal debt to GDP ratio? But for God's sake, don't make paying interest on the national debt a political football. It's bonkers.